Picture yourself as a hunter-gatherer 13,000 years in the past, with no supermarkets, no refrigeration, and certainly no food delivery apps. You're living in a cave, in the region that will someday be called Israel, surrounded by people you genuinely get along with, which honestly might be rarer now than it was then. You've spent the whole day walking, and your feet ache. And you have no idea what it would even mean to own shoes worth more than $100, which is really the only aspect of your life that sounds better than the modern version. Then one day, somebody in your group comes across grain that had been left sitting in a wet stone bowl for longer than it should have been. It gives off an odd smell. It's got a strange, bubbling texture. Clearly, something has changed about it. Something living, something nobody quite understands. And despite every instinct a reasonable creature should have, telling them not to, somebody decides to drink it anyway. That individual might be one of the most consequential people who ever lived, because that one moment of reckless, almost absurd curiosity may have redirected the entire course of human history. Not just toward parties or the wine-fueled honesty of a relative at a holiday dinner, but towards something much bigger. Civilization, farming, religion, written language, essentially the whole framework of how humans organize their lives together. So the real question is, when did people first start drinking alcohol? And more importantly, what drove them to do it in the first place? Get ready, because the story stretches back much further than most people assume, and it doesn't begin with humans at all. It begins with monkeys. Let's start with a question that might sound absurd at first glance, but turns out to be central to everything that follows. Were human bodies actually built to handle alcohol? Most animals that consume any real quantity of ethanol either collapse or suffer badly for it. Their systems just aren't equipped to break it down, and their livers react almost instantly in protest. For the vast majority of creatures on this planet, drinking alcohol ranges from unpleasant to outright deadly. Humans, though, along with our nearest primate relatives, are an exception. We carry a particular enzyme, alcohol dehydrogenase 4, or ADH4, that allows us to metabolize ethanol with unusual efficiency. In a real sense, our bodies are constructed to deal with this substance. And here's the detail that should really catch your attention. That enzyme wasn't something that appeared alongside wine or with the birth of farming. It emerged roughly 10 million years ago. 10 million years puts us well before Homo sapiens, before Homo erectus, before anything resembling a human was walking the earth. That genetic shift happened deep within the primate lineage, right around the time our ancestors were shifting from a life mostly spent in trees to one spent increasingly on the ground. In other words, long before we were ever making a conscious choice to drink, our bodies had already been quietly adapting to that relationship for millions of years. A biologist at UC Berkeley named Robert Dudley spent 25 years investigating why this might be. And the explanation he arrived at carries what might be the best name in scientific history: the Drunken Monkey Hypothesis. The concept is straightforward. Our early primate ancestors relied heavily on fruit, eating massive amounts of it as their main calorie source for millions of years. And fruit that reaches true ripeness starts to ferment naturally. Wild yeast settle on its surface, feed on the sugars within, and release ethanol as a byproduct, giving the fruit a faint alcoholic scent. That means for millions of years, whenever a primate stumbled upon a piece of fruit at peak ripeness, they were also encountering small traces of ethanol. And this is the crucial part. That fermented smell wasn't a signal of danger, it was an invitation. It told the animal that this particular fruit had reached maximum sweetness and maximum calorie content, and that now was the moment to eat it before it disappeared. Ancestors who ignored that smell lost out on easy nutrition to competitors. Those who were drawn toward it, who felt pulled by that scent, ate more, survived longer, and had more offspring, passing that inclination down through generations. Across millions of years, through nothing more complicated than natural selection doing its work, an attraction to the smell and flavor of alcohol became embedded in the primate brain. Evolution essentially wired us to enjoy the scent of alcohol. This isn't some character flaw or sign of weakness. It's 10 million years of adaptation, functioning precisely as it was shaped to. There's really no room to blame yourself here. The Drunken Monkey Hypothesis isn't just an abstract idea either. It's been put to the test. Scientists traveled to Panama to study wild black-handed spider monkeys, gathering samples of the fruit these animals chose to eat and analyzing its alcohol content. What they found was that the fruit these monkeys favored typically contained somewhere between 1 and 2% alcohol by volume, produced naturally through fermentation as the fruit ripened. When researchers examined urine samples from these same free-living monkeys, they discovered byproducts of ethanol breakdown, confirming that the animals weren't just consuming alcohol but actively processing it in their bodies. Even more telling, a separate study of chimpanzees in the Ivory Coast found that their normal daily fruit intake exposed them to roughly the alcohol equivalent of 1 to 2 human drinks every day, without the animals making any deliberate decision about it at all, just from eating their usual food. So technically, your distant ancestor was walking around with a mild buzz in the forest 10 million years ago and had no clue it was happening. That craving, that biological attraction toward alcohol, was already fully in place, long before any human being ever intentionally fermented anything at all. It turns out our connection with alcohol is an extremely old one. So, we've now established that primates spent millions of years unintentionally consuming fermented fruit, and that our bodies evolved specifically to enjoy and process it. But at a certain point, the story shifts. At some stage, an actual cognitively modern human being decided not simply to encounter fermented food by chance, but to make it on purpose. That's an entirely different kind of leap, and a massive one. It requires paying attention, remembering what happened, noticing that something changed in this grain the last time it got wet, and then choosing to repeat that process deliberately. In other words, it requires something close to scientific reasoning. So when exactly did that leap take place? The earliest confirmed evidence of intentional alcohol production by humans comes from a cave in Israel, Rockefet Cave, near what's now the city of Haifa. It served as a burial ground for a group called the Natufians, semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived across the eastern Mediterranean somewhere between 15,000 and 11,500 years ago. These were intelligent, socially advanced people. They buried their dead with flowers. They kept dogs, and in fact, the earliest known evidence of dog domestication comes from Natufian culture. They were not primitive by any reasonable definition. Inside their burial cave, alongside human remains, archaeologists uncovered large stone mortars, carved bowls that still contained residue after 13,000 years. A research team headed by Stanford archaeologist Li Liu studied that residue using microfossil and chemical testing, examining starch granules and tiny plant fragments called phytoliths, and the conclusion was clear. These people had been brewing beer. Not wine, not some undefined fermented drink, but actual beer made from wheat and barley through a 3-step process. First, malting the grain by soaking and letting it germinate, then mashing and heating it, and finally letting it sit and ferment using wild airborne yeast. This was a deliberate, multi-stage, technically advanced brewing method 13,000 years ago. Here's the detail that should really make you pause. This predates farming entirely. The Natufians weren't cultivating crops. They were harvesting wild grain that grew naturally around them. And rather than consuming all of it as food, they set some aside to brew beer, on purpose, as part of a ritual for their dead. This single fact has sparked one of archaeology's most compelling, ongoing debates. Did people first settle into permanent communities and start farming because they wanted a steady grain supply for bread? Or because they wanted a steady grain supply for beer? The beer before bread theory, most associated with archaeologist Brian Hayden, suggests that the desire for a consistent, reliable source of fermented grain drinks might have been one of the main drivers, possibly even the primary one, behind the shift to agriculture. Consider it logically. Why would a hunter-gatherer, already living a workable life by following the seasons and available food sources, suddenly choose to settle down, till soil, plant seeds, and wait months for a harvest? What incentive would make that shift worth it? Beer could be the answer. A dependable supply of it, and beyond that, the capacity to produce a reliable surplus of a calorie-rich, mildly intoxicating drink that also happened to be safer to consume than untreated local water that could be shared during group gatherings, used to honor the deceased, and mark seasonal or sacred transitions in life. This remains a genuinely contested idea. Many archaeologists still maintain that bread and basic nutrition came first, with beer developing later as a natural extension of grain processing that already existed for food purposes. But the discovery at the Natufian site has given real weight to the beer first argument, because here we have people brewing 13,000 years ago, before agriculture existed anywhere on the planet. The urge to produce alcohol clearly came before organized farming did. The timeline itself is settled, even if the interpretation of it is still very much debated. Take a moment to consider that. The earliest known deliberate alcohol production on Earth wasn't the work of farmers, city dwellers, or the kinds of people we typically think of when we imagine the beginnings of civilization. It came from nomadic cave-dwelling communities, created in the context of burying and honoring their dead. From its earliest origins, alcohol was never simply about enjoyment or leisure. It carried spiritual weight. Let's continue moving through history, because after the Natufians, evidence of alcohol production begins appearing rapidly and from many different places at once. Jumping forward roughly 4,000 years to around 7,000 BCE, which sounds distant but is actually fairly recent compared to everything discussed so far, we arrive at Jiahu, a Neolithic settlement in China's Yellow River Valley. A team led by molecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern of the University of Pennsylvania studied residue found inside early clay jars, unearthed at the site. What they discovered was striking. A combined fermented drink made from rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit, and possibly grapes as well, dating back 9,000 years. It's essentially an ancient version of a mixed cocktail. Around that same era, in the country now known as Georgia, in a small village called Gadakrilli Gora, archaeologists uncovered evidence of winemaking dating back roughly 8,000 years. Large clay storage vessels there still carried the chemical traces of grape fermentation. This currently stands as the oldest confirmed wine production known anywhere in the world. Georgia continues to produce wine using traditional methods, fermenting it in large clay vessels called cuvevri buried underground. And Georgians will proudly, and quite fairly, claim they were the ones who invented wine. There's really no strong counter-argument, nor much reason to make one. Back in China, at the same site of Jiahu, dated to around 9,000 years ago, researchers also found pottery containing beer brewed from rice and a grain called Job's tears, which is still cultivated across East Asia today. Even more notable, Jiahu also produced the earliest known evidence of mold-based fermentation starters, a method using specific fungi to break down complex starches in grain before fermentation even begins. This technique predates any written documentation of the practice by thousands of years, and it's the direct ancestor of the processes used today to produce sake, baijiu, Korean makgeolli, and many other East Asian fermented drinks, representing 9,000 years of unbroken tradition, linking a Neolithic clay vessel to a glass poured in Tokyo tonight. What this geographic spread reveals is remarkable. These civilizations, in China, Georgia, and the Eastern Mediterranean, had no contact with one another. They weren't exchanging techniques or recipes. Each independently arrived at the discovery of fermentation, and they did so within roughly the same window of prehistoric time. This tells us fermentation wasn't some singular lucky accident that then spread outward. It's something humans naturally stumble upon whenever they're given grain, fruit, or honey, enough time, and enough curiosity. It happens again and again. As a species, we appear to be permanently and predictably drawn toward fermentation. Now, let's turn to the civilization that transformed alcohol from a discovery into a fully organized institution. Mesopotamia, the land situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what's now Iraq. First the Sumerians, then the Akkadians, then the Babylonians. This is also the place where writing was invented. And it's probably not a coincidence that among the earliest written records are documents about beer. Archaeological findings from Göbekli Tepe, located in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, date beer production in the broader Mesopotamian region to as early as 3,500 BCE. Chemists identified calcium oxalate, a compound produced during beer fermentation, preserved and crystallized within ancient clay containers. That same site also produced the earliest chemically verified evidence of wine in the Near East. But Mesopotamia didn't stop at simply drinking. It turned drinking into a structured social and economic system, which is perhaps the most fitting example imaginable of how thoroughly organized that civilization was. Sumerian laborers were given daily beer rations as a core part of their pay. This wasn't an occasional perk, it was built into the system itself. Whether you were building a temple, copying tablets as a scribe, or maintaining irrigation channels as a farmer, beer was part of your compensation. Detailed administrative records survive, showing these distributions tracked with the same careful precision a modern payroll system might use. Average workers might receive around 2 liters of beer daily, while higher-ranking officials received more. Even the dead were provided with beer, apparently meant to sustain them on their journey into the afterlife, since the Sumerians evidently saw no reason death should interrupt one's regular allowance. Beer functioned as currency, as wages, as religion, as medicine, and essentially as the glue holding the social order together. The Sumerians' devotion to beer ran so deep that they dedicated an entire goddess to it. Her name was Ninkasi, which translates beautifully as the lady who fills the mouth. She was described as the daughter of Enki, the creator god, and Ninti, queen of the sacred lake. She held a significant place in the Sumerian pantheon, and her role wasn't limited to brewing itself. It extended to the broader civilizing force that fermented grain represented. Around 1800 BCE, an unnamed Sumerian poet wrote a hymn dedicated to her. The hymn to Ninkasi is one of the most remarkable surviving texts from the ancient world. It functions as a religious poem, an expression of devotion to a goddess, and depending on the scholar you ask, it also contains within its verses something close to an actual brewing recipe. Written across 2 clay tablets, it outlines the malting of grain, the baking of that grain into a bread called bapir, the soaking process, the fermentation, and the filtering of the finished liquid through a woven basket. The instructions are detailed enough that in 1989, American brewer Fritz Maytag, founder of San Francisco's Anchor Brewing Company, attempted to recreate the recipe. The finished product was served at the annual gathering of the American Association of Microbrewers, with attendees drinking it from clay jugs using long straws, the same way the Sumerians once did. The resulting beer had an alcohol content of about 3.5%, and its flavor was described as something like champagne combined with dates. Nearly 3,800 years after that hymn was composed, the recipe still functioned, which is a testament either to the precision of ancient Sumerian brewing knowledge, to the fundamental reliability of fermentation as a natural process, or, most likely, to both. The Babylonians, who absorbed and built upon much of Sumerian culture, pushed this even further. They cataloged at least 70 distinct types of beer. 70, including light versions, dark versions, filtered beer, beer sweetened with honey, spiced variations, and regional styles. They had developed a full classification system for fermented beverages at a time when most of humanity was still figuring out its first agricultural settlements. And then there's a detail that never fails to be amusing. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest surviving written legal codes in existence, dating to roughly 1754 BCE, actually contains specific laws about beer, covering minimum quality requirements for taverns, proper pricing standards for various grades of beer, and consequences for tavern owners caught diluting their product. If you were caught watering down your beer in ancient Babylon, the punishment was being thrown into the river. Humanity's earliest major legal code included what amounts to consumer protection legislation for alcohol quality. It seems that, as a species, we've always understood what genuinely matters. Egypt deserves its own separate discussion here, because the Egyptians approached this a bit differently and, in many respects, in a more interesting way. Ancient Egyptians drank both beer and wine, and both played central roles in their everyday and religious lives. The laborers who constructed the pyramids, who research over recent decades has shown were not slaves, received consistent rations of beer and bread as the basic foundation of both their diet and their compensation. Egyptian beer, brewed mainly from emmer wheat, was thick, nourishing, and relatively low in alcohol compared to modern standards. In a region where Nile water could carry harmful pathogens, a fermented beverage with natural antimicrobial qualities was often a genuinely healthier choice to drink. In a real sense, beer functioned as a form of public health infrastructure. Wine, by contrast, carried an air of status. It was reserved for the elite, for major ceremonies, for offerings made to the gods, and for placement in the tombs of pharaohs. When archaeologists open royal Egyptian tombs, they consistently find sealed and clearly labeled wine jars, labeled not only with the year the wine was produced, but also the specific vineyard it came from, and in some instances, even the name of the vintner responsible. These represent the oldest wine labels known to exist, sealed inside tombs for 3,000 years. The Egyptians credited the gift of beer to Osiris, the god associated with death, resurrection, and the eternal cycle of renewal, framing it not as something negative, but as a genuine civilizing gift. Within Egyptian religious belief, beer stood alongside bread and medicine as one of the foundational elements that defined civilized human life. There's a clear thread that connects all of this together, running from the Natufians to Sumer to Egypt to ancient China. In nearly every culture and every archaeological site where we find the earliest signs of deliberate alcohol production, it's tied directly to ritual, to the sacred, to death and burial, to offerings and prayer, and to the passage between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond it. The Natufians brewed beer inside a burial cave, specifically to honor their dead. The Sumerians created an entire goddess devoted to brewing and treated beer as a core part of religious practice. The Egyptians offered wine to Osiris at the threshold between this life and the next. Ancient Chinese burial sites, dating back 9,000 years, contain painted pottery vessels that once held beer intended for the deceased. Across every continent where this has been studied, the earliest known alcohol production in human history is consistently and fundamentally connected to spirituality, community, and sacred meaning. This pattern is not coincidental. There's something about the altered state of awareness that fermented drinks produce, the loosening of ordinary perception, that people across history have consistently treated as significant, as a kind of gateway, a way of stepping beyond normal individual experience to touch something bigger than themselves. Whether you understand that through a spiritual, neurological, or purely social lens, the pattern holds true regardless. Humans didn't create alcohol simply as a way to escape the difficulties of daily prehistoric life. They discovered and refined it as a way of marking the moments that carried the most meaning: birth, death, harvest, prayer, the changing of seasons, and the bonds that held communities together. So, when did ancient people first begin drinking alcohol? The full answer covers an almost impossibly vast stretch of time. The biological groundwork, the genetic tools that let us break down ethanol, and the built-in preference that drew us towards seeking it out, were established roughly 10 million years ago in the primate ancestors we share with every living monkey and ape today. Our bodies were molded by millions of years spent discovering fermented fruit in forests, long before any human being ever made a conscious decision to create a drink. The first intentional production of alcohol, 13,000 years ago, was confirmed in a cave in Israel, made by hunter-gatherers brewing beer as an act of devotion to their dead. From there, the practice spread across civilizations over the following several thousand years, developing independently and around the same time in China, Georgia, Iran, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and elsewhere. From that point onward, the historical record becomes considerably clearer. Beer rations distributed throughout Sumer, wine placed in Egypt's royal tombs, hymns composed in praise of brewing goddesses, legal codes protecting the quality sold in taverns, and an unbroken thread of fermentation knowledge linking a Neolithic clay pot to every bar, winery, brewery, and kitchen that exists in the world today. The next time somebody hands you a drink, take a second to consider the full history behind what you're holding. That glass connects through an unbroken line of human curiosity, ritual, survival, and community, all the way back to a hunter-gatherer standing inside a cave 13,000 years ago, tasting something odd and unfamiliar, and finding it, against all reasonable expectation, good. And behind that moment stretches another 10 million years of monkeys moving through the forest, drawn by the smell of something sweet and slightly off, and choosing every single time to move toward it. Humanity didn't accidentally end up with alcohol. We were drawn toward it steadily, the way a plant leans naturally toward sunlight. And that's where I'll leave it. I'm going to go get thoroughly drunk now. In the meantime, go ahead and click on the next video. Seriously, just click it.